High in the Sierra Nevada of California, a few miles above the little town of Colfax, there is a place where the mountainside falls away in a sheer wall of granite more than 1,000 feet down to the North Fork of the American River. They call it Cape Horn. And carved into the face of that cliff, running along it in a long graceful curve, there is a shelf, a ledge just wide enough for a railroad, and trains have been rolling along it for more than 150 years. It looks, when you see it, like it must have been done with machines, cut into the rock by some great engine. It was not. That ledge was chipped and drilled and blasted out of a vertical granite cliff, more than 1,300 feet above the river, entirely by hand, in the middle of the 1860s, by men who were lowered down the rock face on ropes to do it. And almost all of those men were Chinese. They were part of the great army of Chinese laborers who built the western half of the first transcontinental railroad, thousands upon thousands of them, who did the hardest and most dangerous work on the entire line, and who cut this impossible ledge into the side of a mountain. And here is the thing that I have to tell you at the very start, because it shapes this whole story. We do not know their names, not one of them. The company they worked for, the Central Pacific Railroad, kept careful records of its rails and its spikes and its dollars, and kept almost no records at all of the Chinese men who did the work, or of how many of them died doing it. So I cannot give you a single name to hang this story on, and that silence is itself part of what I want you to feel. What I can give you is the work, and the work is extraordinary. The superintendent who drove it was a hard man named James Strobridge. The construction was pushed by the railroad's boss, Charles Crocker. Their names survive. The men who actually went over the edge of the cliff on ropes and hung there chipping at the granite, theirs do not. So let this be for them. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button, come back, start with what they were trying to do, because Cape Horn was one small, terrible piece of one of the largest undertakings in American history. In the 1860s, the country was racing to link itself together with a railroad from coast to coast, and the western half of that line, the Central Pacific, had the very worst of the job. It had to climb out of Sacramento and up over the Sierra Nevada, one of the highest and most rugged mountain ranges on the continent, through country that had killed the Donner Party 20 years before. The whole idea had begun with a visionary engineer named Theodore Judah, who had walked the Sierra and found a way over it that others swore did not exist, and who talked 4 Sacramento shopkeepers into bankrolling a railroad across the mountains. Those 4 men, Charles Crocker, Collis Huntington, Leland Stanford, and Mark Hopkins, would become known as the Big Four, and they would grow fabulously rich off the railroad, though Judah himself, the man who dreamed it, died before the first serious mountain work even began. What the Big Four had bought into was a challenge on a scale the country had never attempted. They had to lay tracks up and over a wall of granite peaks, gaining thousands of feet of elevation through some of the deepest snow country on the continent, and they were doing it against the clock, because a second company, the Union Pacific, was building west toward them across the plains, and every mile each company finished meant more land and more government money. Speed was everything, and you cannot have speed without men. And the Central Pacific could not find enough men to do it. The work was brutal, and the pay was ordinary, and in a California still full of gold rush dreams, white laborers signed on, collected a few paychecks, and walked off to try their luck in the diggings. The railroad was desperate. So, Charles Crocker made a suggestion that his own superintendent, Strobridge, at first flatly refused. Crocker said, "Hire Chinese workers." There were thousands of Chinese immigrants in California, most of them from the hard-pressed districts of southern China, who had come across the Pacific looking for a way to survive and send money home. Strobridge did not believe they could do the work. They were smaller men, on average, than the Irish laborers he was used to, and he said so, bluntly and with contempt. Crocker's answer became famous. "They built the Great Wall of China," he said. "They can build a railroad." And so, over the doubts of the men running it, the Central Pacific began hiring Chinese workers, and almost at once it became clear that Crocker was right and Strobridge was wrong. The Chinese crews were disciplined, they were skilled, they learned fast, they did not drink themselves off the job, and they worked with a steadiness that astonished the men who had doubted them. Before long, the railroad could not have been built without them. At the peak, the great majority of the Central Pacific's workforce, many thousands of men, was Chinese. In the end, Something like 9 of every 10 men swinging a pick or setting a charge on the Central Pacific was Chinese. Over the course of the work, the railroad hired well over 10,000 of them, recruiting not only from the Chinese already in California, but directly from the districts of southern China. Whole shiploads of men brought across the Pacific specifically to build this line. Most of them came from the country around the Pearl River Delta, a region torn in those years by war and famine, and many came on a credit system, their passage paid in advance and worked off out of their wages, so that they arrived already in debt and owing their labor before they had swung a single hammer. They were organized into gangs, each with its own headman who spoke for the crew and its own cook who kept it fed, a structure that let thousands of men be directed across a mountain range with real efficiency. The white bosses gave the orders at the top. But down where the rock was actually broken, the work was Chinese, run by Chinese, done by Chinese, mile after mile, over the highest and hardest ground on the whole transcontinental line. And there is a detail about how they lived that turned out to matter enormously. The Chinese workers ate and drank differently from the other laborers. Where the white and Irish crews often drank the local water raw and hit the whiskey hard, the Chinese boiled their water constantly to make tea, and drank that all day long. They ate a varied diet brought in specially for them, rice and dried vegetables and seafood and tea, instead of the beef and potatoes and bad water of the other camps. At the time, it was mocked as strange foreign habit. In fact, it very likely saved a great many of their lives, because boiling the water for tea killed the germs that caused the dysentery and the camp sickness that tore through the other crews. They were, by nearly every account, cleaner, soberer, and healthier than the men who looked down on them, and it showed in the work. While other crews were laid up sick or sleeping off a drunk, the Chinese gangs were up on the mountain, drilling. That was the workforce, then, that carried the Central Pacific up into the High Sierra, the disciplined Chinese gangs doing the hardest of the digging and the drilling, mile after climbing mile, while the great engine of the transcontinental race pushed them ever higher and ever faster. Sacramento, where the line began, sits almost at sea level. The pass the railroad had to reach lay more than 7,000 feet up. Every mile of that climb had to be blasted and graded out of the mountainside by hand, and a few miles above a little town called Colfax, the mountain threw down a challenge that looked, at first sight, like the end of the whole enterprise. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. And then the line reached Cape Horn, and the mountain presented the engineers with a wall. The railroad had to get around a great shoulder of the Sierra, a promontory of solid granite, and there was no way over it, and no way through it, and no way around it on easy ground. The only route ran straight across the face of the cliff, a nearly vertical drop of well over 1,000 feet down to the river at the bottom of the canyon. To carry a railroad across that face, they would have to create a ledge where none existed, cut a shelf into the sheer rock, wide enough and level enough for a train, hanging on the side of the mountain above that terrible drop. It is the kind of problem that, looked at cold, seems less like engineering than like something you would refuse to attempt. And they had no machines to do it with. They had human beings, and hand tools, and black powder, and rope. Stand at Cape Horn and look at what they were facing, and the scale of it hits you in the stomach. The promontory is a great rounded shoulder of granite, where the mountain juts out over a bend in the canyon, and the North Fork of the American River runs at the bottom, a silver thread so far below that it looks like something drawn on a map rather than a real river a man could drown in. The rock is Sierra granite, hard, unforgiving stone, the same stone that makes the high peaks, and it does not crumble or flake away helpfully. It has to be broken. The face the railroad had to cross falls away below the grade for well over 1,000 feet, steep enough that a dropped tool would be gone before it landed, steep enough that there was nowhere at all to simply stand while you worked. Most cliffs, however sheer, give you a ledge here, a crack there, some purchase for a hand or a foot. Cape Horn, right where the line had to go, gave nothing. It was as close to a blank vertical wall of solid granite as a railroad was ever pushed across, and it stood more than 1,000 feet in the air. So consider for a moment what the first day of that job actually required, because it is almost beyond belief. Before you can cut a ledge into a cliff, you have to get a man onto the cliff, onto a blank vertical face of granite, with no foothold anywhere, and 1,000 feet of open air beneath him. And the way they did it was to lower the men down from above on ropes. Now there is a famous story, told for generations, that the workers were lowered in woven wicker baskets, sitting in them like buckets down a well, swinging against the rock. Historians who have gone back to the records have come to doubt the baskets, and the actual documented account is in some ways even more sobering. A report from the time says plainly that the men who broke the first ground on Cape Horn were held by ropes, suspended against the cliff, until they could chip out footholds in the rock, solid enough to stand on. Picture that, a man on the end of a rope, hanging against a granite wall 1,000 feet up, with a hammer and a steel drill, chipping at the stone with his own arms until he has carved a notch just big enough to set his foot in, and then another, so that he can begin to stand where a moment before there was nothing but a sheer face and a fatal drop. And once they had those first footholds, the real work began, and it was the same work, over and over, all along the face of the cliff. A man would brace himself on his hard-won foothold, and with a hammer and a length of steel, he would drill a hole into the granite, by hand, turning the drill a little after each blow, striking it again, for hours, to sink a hole deep enough to take a charge. Then the holes would be packed with black blasting powder and fused, and the men would clear away, and the charges would blast a bite out of the cliff. And then they would come back, and climb down again, and clear the broken rock, and set new footholds, and drill again, bite by bite, blast by blast, hole drilled by aching hand after hole drilled by aching hand. The ledge crept along the face of Cape Horn. They used hundreds of kegs of powder. They filled the canyon with the sound of hammers and blasts for the better part of a year. And slowly, out of the blank granite wall, a shelf appeared, curving around the great shoulder of the mountain. A road for the trains hung on the side of a cliff. It is worth slowing down on that drilling, because it was the heart of the whole job, and it was punishing beyond description. To drill a hole in granite by hand, a man held a steel bar against the rock and struck it with a hammer, then rotated it a quarter turn, and struck it again, and again, hour after hour, and after all of that a single hole might sink only a few feet into the stone. Sometimes one man held and turned his own drill and swung his own hammer at it. Sometimes one man held the steel steady while a partner swung a heavy sledge, and the man holding it trusted his partner's aim with his own hands inches from the blow, over and over, all day. Every foot of the ledge at Cape Horn stands for an uncountable number of those hammer strokes, ringing off the granite above that 1,000-foot drop, in the heat and in the cold. There was no drill motor, no compressor, no machine of any kind anywhere on that cliff. There was a man, a hammer, a steel bar, and a mountain, and the man won, one blow at a time. Before I tell you what happened next, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories unless enough people click. One click. Come back. Every part of that work was deadly. A man on a rope on a cliff can fall, and men did. A charge of black powder can go off early, before the men are clear, and charges did. Loose rock can let go from above without warning and sweep a man off his foothold into the void, and it happened. The winters up there are savage, and the cold and the storms killed men too. And here is where the silence I told you about at the beginning becomes a wound, because the Central Pacific Railroad, which counted everything, did not count these deaths. It kept no reliable record of how many Chinese workers died at Cape Horn, or in the tunnels, or anywhere along the line. We know men died there. We do not know how many, and we do not know who. Their families in China knew when the letters and the money stopped coming, but the company that sent them onto that cliff did not think their names worth writing down. When people later gathered up the bones of Chinese workers along the line to send home for burial, there were, by some accounts, many hundreds of pounds of them. That is the measure of the cost, in a country that would not keep the count. And the men knew exactly how they were being treated, and at least once, they pushed back hard. In the summer of 1867, up in the high country, thousands of Chinese workers put down their tools and went on strike. They wanted what any worker wants: higher pay, shorter hours, and an end to being beaten and held on the job against their will. For a few days, the greatest workforce on the mountain simply stopped, and the whole railroad ground to a halt. It was one of the largest labor actions anywhere in the country at that time. And the way the railroad broke it was to cut off the strikers' food. Out in the high Sierra, with winter coming on and nowhere else to turn, the men who controlled the supply wagons simply stopped feeding thousands of workers until hunger drove them back to the rock. Within about a week, the strike was over, and the men went back to drilling, for not much more than they had before. It is not a comfortable story, but it tells you these were not passive tools. They were men who understood their own worth and demanded to be treated like it, and were starved back into line for daring to ask. In May of 1866, after most of a year on the cliff, the ledge at Cape Horn was finished. The roadbed was graded, the ties were laid, the rails went down, and the trains began to roll around the face of the mountain, out over that 1,000-foot drop, on a shelf that human hands had carved into solid granite. And almost immediately, Cape Horn became one of the most famous sights on the entire transcontinental railroad. As the line opened and tourists began to ride the rails west, the run around Cape Horn, with the train seeming to hang in the air above the American River far below, was the thrill everyone wrote home about. Guidebooks marveled at it. Passengers held their breath as the cars swept around the curve with nothing but sky on the downhill side. People came from all over the world to experience the sensation of riding across the face of that cliff. And very few of them, then or since, gave a single thought to the men who had hung on ropes to make it, or asked why not one of those men had a name. Ride that stretch of railroad today, and the thrill the old guidebooks promised is entirely real. The train slows and swings out onto the curve, and suddenly the ground is simply gone on one side, and you are looking down, and down, and down, past the very edge of the roadbed to the river, a quarter of a mile below, with nothing between you and it but open air. Your body does not quite believe the track will hold. And it is precisely at that moment, when every passenger is gasping at the drop, that you are riding on the single most astonishing part of the whole thing, because that roadbed under the wheels, that impossibly narrow shelf clinging to the vertical granite, is the part a man carved out of the blank cliff with a hammer and a steel drill while hanging on a rope. The view that thrills the tourist is the view that Worker had, every day, for a year, except that he was not safe inside a railroad car. He was out on the rock itself, in the wind, holding a drill in one hand and his own life in the other. And he did it not as a heroic one-time feat, but as a job, a shift, a thing he got up and did again the next morning, and the morning after that. For wages he had to strike and starve even to try to raise, in a country that would take the railroad he built and leave him out of the photograph. The courage it took was not the sharp, bright courage of a single brave moment. It was the long, grinding, daily courage of a man who is afraid and does the terrifying thing anyway, over and over, because his family across the ocean is counting on the money, and because the work is the work. That is the kind of courage that actually builds countries, and it is exactly the kind we are worst at remembering, because it does not come with a name or a statue, only a ledge on a cliff and a train still running on it 150 years later. One quick note, I turned the full story into a book, everything the records gave me. If you want it, the link is in the description. So let me tell you what we do know about them, because they deserve at least that. The men who built Cape Horn were, for the most part, young men from the districts around the Pearl River Delta in southern China, a region racked in those years by war and famine and poverty, and they had crossed the Pacific in crowded ships to a country that did not want them, to do work that country's own people would not do, for wages lower than a white laborer would accept. They lived in their own camps, cooked their own food, kept their own customs, and were looked down on and mocked and cheated by many of the people around them, and they built the railroad. They did the digging and the drilling and the blasting, the deadliest jobs on the deadliest stretches, and they did it so well that the hard men who had doubted them ended up depending on them completely. They sent their pay home across the ocean to keep their families alive. Some of them, when the railroad was done, stayed and built lives in America against enormous hostility. Many went home, and a great many of them are still up there, in the mountains, in unmarked ground, because they never came down off the Sierra at all. When the two railroads finally met, in 1869, at Promontory in Utah, and the famous Golden Spike was driven to join the country from coast to coast, a photographer captured the moment. Two locomotives nose to nose, a crowd of men celebrating on and around them. It is one of the most reproduced photographs in all of American history. And there is not a single Chinese face in it. The men who had built the hardest half of that railroad, who had cut the ledge at Cape Horn and bored the tunnels through the summit, were not invited into the picture. A Chinese crew, by most accounts, laid the very last rails that day, and then stepped aside so the important men could pose. That photograph, with its missing faces, is the whole injustice in a single frame. For more than a century afterward, The story of the Transcontinental Railroad was told as the triumph of a handful of visionaries and a great faceless mass of labor, and the men of Cape Horn stayed nameless and faceless, exactly as the company had left them. Only in recent decades has the country begun, slowly, to set that right, to honor the Chinese railroad workers properly, to mark the places where they worked and died, and to say plainly what the records tried to hide, that without them, there would have been no railroad at all. And after the work was done, the last debt was paid in a way that should stay with you. In the years that followed, crews went along the line and gathered up the bones of the Chinese workers who had died building it, hundreds and hundreds of men, so that their remains could be shipped back across the Pacific to rest in the villages they had come from. The company had not counted them in life, but their own people counted them in death and carried them home, because to the families across the ocean, these were not nameless laborers. They were sons and husbands and fathers, each one with a name, even if the only place that name was ever written down was on a grave on the other side of the world. In our own time, the descendants of those workers, along with historians and the whole Chinese-American community, have worked to recover what the railroad threw away. Scholars have combed the surviving records for any scrap that remains, any payroll fragment, any letter, any single name. Memorials have gone up. The Chinese railroad workers have been formally honored, generations too late, as exactly what they always were, the men who made the Transcontinental Railroad possible. It can never be enough, because the thing that was taken, the names, the true count of the dead, the faces that belonged in that photograph, cannot be handed back. But it is something. And it means that when you stand at Cape Horn now and watch a train sweep around that cliff, you are no longer looking at an anonymous marvel. You are looking at the work of a specific people who came from a specific place and suffered and endured and achieved something extraordinary and are owed, at long last, a specific and lasting respect. I think about what a modern engineer sees when he looks at the ledge at Cape Horn, because his admiration is total. He sees a railroad grade cut into a vertical granite cliff more than 1,300 feet above a river, laid out on a curve smooth enough and level enough that trains still run it a century and a half later, and he understands that it was done with hand drills and black powder and men on ropes, without a single machine. He sees one of the genuinely great pieces of hand engineering in the country, accomplished under conditions that would stop a modern crew cold. And then, if he knows the story, he sees the other thing, which is that the men who did it were treated as disposable, worked in the most dangerous places for the lowest pay, and then written out of the record so completely that we cannot name a single one of them. The ledge is a monument to their skill. The silence around it is a monument to something much darker. Both monuments are real, and both are standing on that cliff right now, and an honest look at Cape Horn has to take in the whole of it, the astonishing skill and the shameful forgetting together, because that is the truth of how a great deal of this country actually got built. That is the thing I want to leave you with. The next time you see a photograph of a train sweeping around the face of Cape Horn, high above the American River, do not just admire the engineering, though the engineering deserves every bit of admiration. Remember that a real man, with a real name that we will never know, hung on a rope against that cliff and chipped the first foothold into the blank rock with his own hands, 1,000 feet above the water, so that the country could be joined coast to coast. Thousands of men like him built the hardest miles of the Transcontinental Railroad and died along it in numbers no one bothered to count, and were paid the least and thanked the least and remembered the least of anyone who ever built anything in this country. The ledge they carved is still there. The trains still run on it. It is one of the most beautiful and impossible things ever built by hand on this continent, and it is theirs, and the very least we owe them, now, is to look at it and say so, out loud. And there is one more reason to remember it, beyond simple justice. We are living, right now, off the work of people like them, all around us, all the time. The roads we drive, the rails we ride, the tunnels and bridges and canals that make an ordinary day possible, were very often built by people at the bottom of the ladder, immigrants and the poor and the unwanted, doing dangerous work for low pay and no glory, and then vanishing out of the story, while the men who financed it took the credit and the statues. Cape Horn is not an exception to that. It is the rule, made unusually visible, because the work is so obviously impossible and the erasure so obviously complete. When we finally learn to look at that ledge and see the men on the ropes, we are practicing something we badly need to get better at, which is seeing the hands underneath everything we have. It is one of the greatest works of hand engineering in the history of this country, and it was built by people we chose to forget. Both of those things are true at once, and holding them together, the wonder and the wrong, is the whole of what it means to remember Cape Horn honestly. That is worth remembering. That is worth saying out loud. One more thing, if you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month, public shout-out in upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from boss tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.